everyone. I'm Dave Gray-Donald, and I'm the Publicity and Promotions Manager at Between the Lines. And thanks so much for joining us for the launch of Class Action, How Ontario's Elementary Teachers Became a Political Force by Andy Hanson. We'll just do some intro remarks and I'll introduce the panelists, and we're just waiting for a few more participants to trickle in. Thanks so much for joining us on this Thursday evening. And I just want to do a little treaty land acknowledgement that I and Between the Lines Publishing House are on Dish with One Spoon treaty territory in Toronto, and we're a publishing house committed to decolonization. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about Between the Lines. We're a independent radical publishing house that's founded in 1977, and we're very, very pleased to be publishing Class Action. It continues a long tradition of labor publishing. Some other labor titles that have come out this fall include, I'm getting some glare, Code White, sounding the alarm on violence against healthcare workers. A really shocking, eye-opening look at what's happening in the healthcare system. And we also have a long tradition of feminist publishing, which this book continues. This spring, we published Bent Out of Shape, Shame, Solidarity, and Women's Bodies at Work by ergonomist Karen Messing. And we've also published, some theory work. So this is Women and Work by Susan Ferguson, which sort of delves into Marxist understandings of women's labor, and labor in general. So you should check out our books at btlbooks.com. I'll post the link in the chat, and also in the chat, feel free to say hi. I'm assuming there's a number of teachers here tonight, and we're thrilled to have you. You can post in the chat, say hi, maybe what local you're from. I don't know firsthand, but from everything I understand, teachers, you've been going through so much over the last 18 months, and it's in Ontario right now. Things just keep continuing. The fight never ends with the government of Ontario. All solidarity to you in the fight for safe workplaces. The mask mandates. Anyway, we can get into that more in the discussion, but I just wanted to say hi, and you can feel free to say hi to each other in the chat. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists for the evening. So first off, the star of the show, Andy Hanson. So Andy is the author of Class Action and was a longtime teacher and former ETFO local executive, and a recent PhD graduate from Trent University. Then we have Shirley Bell, who is a current ETFO vice president of the provincial body, and was the former president of the Kawartha Pine Ridge ETFO local. And just for anyone, sorry, I'm putting jargon in here already. The ETFO is the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, the union of all the elementary teachers in Ontario. We also have, we're overjoyed to have Vivian McCaffrey, a former ETFO coordinator of communications and political action. And finally, Bryan Palmer, Professor Emeritus of Canadian Studies at Trent University and the author of many books, just a very prolific and an influential historian. Books like co-author of Toronto's Poor with Gaetan Heroux, which is published by Between the Lines, and lots of other books. If you want to learn about Canadian history and labor history and American left history, you got to read Bryan Palmer. So we're going to start with some opening remarks. And Andy Hanson, the author, is going to get us started. Andy, can you tell us a bit about the book? I know you want to tell people a bit of how it came into being.
Yeah. So in 2002, I took a trip on the Nahanni River in the Northwest Territories. It was 570 kilometers in 20 days. And somehow I came back knowing I had to write this book. So 19 years later, here it is. I'd like to read the dedication. This book is dedicated to the many teachers I have known who understood the importance of their union, whose struggles achieved what today is taken for granted. And it is for my grandchildren, Nate, Sammy, and Hannah, who will need unions to safeguard their future. Of course, I have a long list of people to thank, but we don't have time to name the many friends and family members who sustained me. However, foremost on the list is Bryan Palmer, without whom this project would never have got off the ground. So thank you, Bryan, for your years, and I do mean years, of support and guidance. Also, the staff at Between the Lines Publishing, who accepted the book and then walked me through another rewrite and multiple edits. So thank you, Amanda, Karina, Tillman, Devin, and of course, you, David, who are moderating tonight. So the book describes the unique relationship. Two unions representing workers with the same employer who do the same job in the same location, divided by sex. The Federation of Women Teachers Associations of Ontario, the FWTAO, organized in 1918. It was the first of Ontario's 5 teachers' unions. The men organized their union, the Ontario Public School Men Teachers Federation, in 1920, after the women repeatedly refused to include them. Men was removed in 1982, making it the OPSTF. The OPSTF was a much smaller organization, but it included almost all the principals and vice principals with their higher pay scales. At a time when, as one OPSTF principal put it, all you needed to be a principal was to wear trousers. He may have been simplifying, but it expressed the truth of the education hierarchy of the day. When women teachers began to demand equal access to promotions, the men were enraged. Historian Joan Sangster calls this the paternalistic aspect of patriarchy, that device which validates the superiority of the male viewpoint. I'm going to read a little. Gendered paternalism legitimized patriarchy. When the FWTAO demanded an alternative organizing of the school system, access to promotions, and equal pay, it confronted the paternalistic structure of institutionalized patriarchal authority. Women were challenging social structures of male supremacy and paternalistic deference. They were overruling masculinity itself, exploding the myth of male superiority. That tension framed the relationship between these two unions. The FWTAO was a leading feminist organization during the second wave feminism of the 1970s through to the 1990s. The Women's Union pushed the Ontario government for equal pay, access to promotions, and the removal of sex role stereotypes in the school curriculum, among other things. Women teachers were instrumental in changing how women were viewed in society and what girls saw themselves as capable of achieving. Well, that's one thread of the book. A second is the politicization of teachers as they advanced from a professional association to what I would argue is the most powerful public sector union in Ontario. In 1973, a one-day province-wide strike gained teachers the legal right to strike. So think about that. In order to have the right to strike, teachers undertook an illegal strike across the province at a time when telegrams were how unions contacted their locals. 24 years later, teachers went to war with Mike Harris in a 2-week political protest, which was, by all appearances, another illegal strike. These two political strikes went beyond business unionism and collective bargaining. They were general strikes against the government of the day. The 1973 strike opened the elementary teachers to the tactics of labor. Their first legal strike was in 1979. The teachers in the Peel Board of Education went on strike for 13 days to gain seniority rights for layoff and recall. Further strikes and strike votes achieved many of the benefits today's teachers take for granted. Maintaining increments on the salary grid for new teachers, Lambton teachers vote to strike. Preparation time, the Metropolitan Toronto teachers strike for 4 weeks. A staffing formula, Brent teachers strike for 22 days. Preventing salary cuts, Windsor teachers strike for 6 weeks. In some instances, trustees' responses were vicious. Other times they were just bizarre. I make the claim that Pierre Trudeau's 1975 wage and price controls were the vanguard of neoliberalism in this country. So at the same time as teachers gained the legal right to strike, neoliberalism became the ideology of governing. In education, we see a turn to centralized control, standardized testing, increased surveillance, cuts to the education budget, and so forth. Neoliberalism expanded its reach through the 1980s until it peaked with the 1995 election of Mike Harris. The election of Mike Harris' conservative government on the 26th of June, 1995 would be the apogee of neoliberalism in Ontario in the 20th century. Little would be left untouched by the Conservatives' election platform, the Common Sense Revolution. Harris vowed to reform the education system, quote, based on the principles of providing excellence, accountability to parents, and reducing the burden on taxpayers, particularly the last one. The battle with the Mike Harris government became a 2-week province-wide strike. Was the strike a failure or a success? Did the elementary teachers capitulate, or did they make a sound decision? These are some of the questions the book attempts to answer. What the strike did do was make the amalgamation of the two unions more palatable when teachers had a common enemy. The book describes how the choice to amalgamate was made, the Human Rights Commission decision that many teachers believed forced the FWTAO into the amalgamation, and the consequences of bringing the two unions together, consequences that affect today's elementary teachers. Examined through a class lens, it is evident that the amalgamation created a more powerful union in the ETFO. The years of suspicion and mistrust that had undermined the strength of both the FWTAO and the OPSTF came to an end. The elementary teachers could pursue their objectives as one body with one voice. In the summer of 2000, delegates to the annual general meeting voted to affiliate with the Canadian Labour Congress and the Ontario Federation of Labour. Ontario elementary teachers formally joined the labor movement. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the panel. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Andy. Just before I invite Bryan to speak, just if you do have questions, you can put those either in the chat or in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we will take questions from the audience after some brief questions among the panelists. Bryan.
Okay, well, thanks very much to David, to Devin, who's behind the mysterious screen, but handling the technologies, and to Between the Lines for facilitating and hosting this event. And it's an honor to be here with Vivian and Shirley, two women who've been on the front lines of the struggles of teacher unionism in the contemporary period. And of course, hats off to Andy Hanson, whose book, Class Action, is, I think, a truly significant contribution to understanding the educational system, the labor and women's movements, contemporary politics, and of course, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, whose history he charts with analytic rigor, political discrimination, and a sensitivity to the gender dynamics that figured so forcefully in this important union's making. Now, the origin of this book, as Andy stated, lie in a PhD thesis, although the thesis is very different from the book that he's produced. And Andy did this at Trent University, and I supervised the dissertation. But as with so many supervisor-student relations, I actually learned so much more from Andy, I think, than he ever possibly could have learned from me. And I think it's important just to convey a little, too, of my admiration for what Andy did, because this is someone who had been active as a teacher, and very active in his teachers union, and at a certain point he basically moved into a second career of trying to research, write, and understand the history that he had lived. This threw him into PhD classes with students a fraction of his age and experience, dealing with a supervisor, not so much younger, but and really it took a lot of courage to do that, I think, and I always admired that, and I think Andy deserves a great deal of credit for embarking on, through his venturesomeness, his curiosity, and his bravery, a different endeavor than he'd spent so much of his life doing. Very few of us, I think, shift gears like that, and it's a credit to him that he did. And the result is something that we all benefit from. It's a unique book. It's a history of the education system. He has a lot of background in there that talks about the education system and its development, which is so fundamental to capitalism, to colonialism, and to the sort of development of ordinary people in our country. He looks at the complex consequences of teacher professionalism and how that, was a difficult relationship with coming to grips with trade unionism and militant action. He looks at the unique history of Ontario, where the teachers' unions were stratified by religion, by language, by gender, by the age of the students. And he focuses on the struggle of teachers to join the labor movement in a period, really, from the mid-1970s into the late 21st century and into the present moment, which is a period of declining expectations for trade unions and workers, when neoliberal assault has been directed against all workers and all workers' organizations. He looks at the complications of working for an employer that was always somewhat fractured and abstract, straddling the authority of local boards of education and the provincial state. And he looks at the dilemma of teachers' militant action, which often could be declared to be illegal, as he pointed out, a point I'll come back to, or could be presented as basically harming the interests of students and dramatically impacting parents. This is a very difficult work environment in which to struggle both for the interests of those that one's serving and for your own betterment of working conditions, wages, and salaries, which of course are not divorced from the students and the parents, teachers being all of those things. And the struggle again for gender equity and against ingrained male supremacy, which had been sanctioned, of course, by the state, and in fact, really mandated by the state in terms of the formation of these differentiated trade union bodies. And yet out of this emerged, in the period from 1973 to 1997, a teachers' unionism that was central to both the labor movement and pivotal in the political campaigns of these years. Sensitive to the gender struggles of women, Andy is not sometimes uncritical of the leaders of the women's teachers' unions. He talks about the whole issue of amalgamation and the extent to which it was difficult to sustain discussions of that, and how sometimes the women's union, actually the leadership wanted to sort of mandate a moratorium on discussion and the problems that posed. He talks about the difficulties of organizing precarious workers. But on balance, Andy sees women as in the vanguard of a progressive feminist unionism, and rightly so. And he presents a history of class actions driving against governments and boards, increasingly dedicated only to the the preservation of their bottom lines. Tories, liberals, and social democrats alike come under scrutiny in this assessment. And this is a history of all teachers and of struggles everywhere in Ontario. And I was always particularly interested in the way in which not just Toronto, which tends to be the focus of a lot of our attention, gets brought into the picture, but how places like Dryden and Lakefield and Parry Sound have their basically turn and time on Andy Hanson's stage. And the ways in which teachers mounted organized resistance, when in the early years covered by the book, they lack the right to strike, are imaginative and bold. Something I think that the labor movement in all of its current work sectors could actually learn from today. The willingness to step outside of notions. I mean, he has fascinating, material on how when you couldn't strike, masses of people got together and would hand in boards, their letters of resignation for a particular time period. So that this was basically saying, here's our clout. We can't strike, but we can quit. A bold move, but one I think that put forward the collective strengths of teachers in particular ways. What is crystal clear from Andy's book is that the actions that galvanized teachers and led to victories that consolidated their trade unionism were in fact illegal. The 1973 strike, as he said in his introduction, launched teachers into the public eye. It was certainly perceived to be illegal. So too were 1997 job actions during the Days of Action and the Mike Harris uncommon sense revolution that targeted teachers as enemies of the people. As an historian, I provided an affidavit for the secondary school teachers when they were hauled into court. I argued that virtually all of the momentous trade union and social justice struggles in history commenced in defiance of then existing laws. It's something that, as trade unions have become ensconced and legally constrained at the same time, more powerful, yet at the same time limited by laws, I think the trade union movement needs to grapple with more frontally. Teachers are a contemporary example of what defiance can actually accomplish. And I saw this firsthand as well in my own experience when I was teaching at Simon Fraser in British Columbia in 1983 in the Solidarity Uprising, where one of the few strikes that I've actually been involved in my lifetime was an educational strike against the government and its restraint packages. Andy Hanson's refusal to simply retire after years of teaching and trade union activity, and his turn instead to research and write the history that he had lived, has left us with a book that will be an enduring legacy, I think, for teacher militants in generations to come. So congratulations to Andy for a job so well done.
Vivian, would you like to go next?
Great. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel this evening, especially joining the esteemed labor historian Bryan Palmer, the very accomplished teacher union activist Shirley Bell, and congratulations, Shirley, on your recent election. That's quite an accomplishment. And of course, I've been a fan of Andy Hanson's for a long time. We first met through, obviously, the political action work that ETFO did. And it was interesting to hear Bryan's comments about, Andy leaving the profession, because I will admit when Andy told me that he was, leaving his role as vice president of his local, I thought, oh, he's retiring. And he said, no, I'm going off to do my PhD. And I thought, well, that's a really noble pursuit. But I know the hard work and the lonely hours that go into a project like that. And I will confess to thinking to myself that Andy would give that up at some point. And I'm glad to say that, I was wrong, and congratulations, Andy. I know that you've always been passionate and committed to things. I also know you've got bred in the bone stubbornness, and I think that's partly what carried you through. You were determined to finish what you set out to do. So I enjoyed reading the book as a former student of history, and certainly someone who's interested in labor history. It was also a very compelling read as someone who worked as a union staff person for 37 years. And Andy's book covers the first half of my career. And so it was really informative, not just sort of a nostalgic experience, but I actually learned things that not only had I forgotten the details of, but my work was, Queen's Park liaison, politics stuff, policy work. The collective bargaining, of course, was the key role of the organization, but I didn't know all the ins and outs of it. And so the book was instructive for me on that score as well. And I want to say, I think Bryan spoke to this, but I really appreciated the extensive research and documentation, the tireless work that Andy put into this book, and congratulate him for creating such a readable and accessible work. So I know you had your thesis, but it was really a worthwhile project to write this book, Andy, because it should reach a broad audience. I wanted to, at the time I've been given, the remaining time, is just identify 5 reasons why I think the book's important. And because this is a book launch, 5 reasons why anyone should buy the book. So first of all, it enriches Ontario Labour historiography. The FWTAO, OPS, MTF, and ETFO all have written or all wrote their own histories, respective histories, which were important. And they were important documentations. By their very nature, however, they are less objective than Andy's work. Their formats didn't allow for the extensive documentation that Andy so meticulously provides. And their primary audience were their members. So the function of those histories were to really educate teachers about their own histories, celebrate their accomplishments and achievements. But class action, as I just mentioned, really should reach a much broader audience. And teachers will obviously be interested, but so should anyone who's interested in labor history generally. So secondly, I think the book connects the militancy and action of women teachers to the advancement of important social gains and educational issues. So while all teacher unions had an important history, the story of women teachers is particularly significant because of the contributions that FWTAO made to the advancement of gender equality and women's rights. And this book is indeed an important addition to the chronicling of that history. Thirdly, the book provides a useful overview of the history of Ontario education generally. And there've been a number of books written about it, Ontario education in a general point of view, but its contextual chronicling of the history of elementary teachers contributes to our broader understanding of the social and economic changes of the 20th century and the key events and policies that brought about changes to education. And I think reading through the book, it was just really important to sort of resituate myself into some of the key events and policies and reports that came out that influenced and shaped Ontario education today. And I thought Andy did a really good job doing that. Fourthly, I think the book looks at the social and economic barriers facing women during the period studied through the experience of teachers. For example, salary differentials, employment discrimination based on marriage status, pregnancy, and so on, the limits of promotion. And by documenting the struggles that women teachers faced in their professional lives, we have very much an enriched understanding of the barriers that women face generally. So class action provides a unique lens through which to follow the evolution of issues related to gender equality, both within the teaching profession and in society at large. And finally, I think, and Bryan alluded to this as well, the book brings to the fore the interesting and important evolution of elementary teachers as a militant group and their identity as full-fledged members of the union movement. It tells the story of what led to the amalgamation of FW and OPSTF, and understanding the history of the two unions up until that time is key to understanding its post-1998 history, during which time, as Andy mentioned, ETFO joined very quickly the OFL and the CLC, and it was really interesting as a staff person to watch ETFO activists starting to identify themselves as members of the union movement. When I started, and even a decade before, there were conversations in teacher classroom or teacher staff rooms about, whether teachers belong to a federation or a union and whether it was appropriate to join a union. My mother was a teacher during the 60s, and she would talk about that. So it wasn't that long, but it was an interesting transition to go from when teachers were debating whether they, even wanted to be a member of a union, about being very much proud of being part of the union movement. So I think it's just a really important book that sets the stage for the second and the current historical period of ETFO. I'm waiting for the sequel written by somebody, a budding historian in the next generation. But the next part of ETFO's history is also incredibly important and interesting, I think. So thanks for writing the book, Andy.
Vivian. And that's a great segue. The next chapter is being written, and I'll pass it off to ETFO Vice President Shirley Bell.
Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. And it is definitely an honor to be with an amazing group of panelists. And congratulations, Andy, on your book. So I think I'm actually going to be talking about ETFO presently and connecting some of Andy's research to where we are now. So when I started teaching, I became an ETFO member. And having just celebrated ETFO's 20th anniversary not that long ago, most members are like me, and they have only ever been ETFO members. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading Class Action. I found it such an incredible, interesting history of how elementary teacher union activism in Ontario has grown and where it started, and with great content from FWTAO and OPSTF. Teaching is my second career. So there was a few things in that book that brought me back to when I was a QP president and working as a residential counselor, and having that fight around pay equity. But I spent several years as a classroom teacher and then served as a local president in Kawartha Pine Ridge for a few years. And then as of August, as you may know, I was newly elected as one of the vice presidents at ETFO. So the question of different education unions is still very much alive in Ontario, and of course, in that we have 4 unions that represent educators. But the old divisions between FWTAO and OPSTF have mostly faded. But I will say that one of the most important aspects in the formation of ETFO was the preservation of women's leadership. That was incredibly important, as Andy points out in Class Action. There were several significant agreements in the ETFO Constitution from the first convention, with 2 of them being the 6% funding for women's programs, which continues today, and designated positions for women. And this has since been expanded to include 5 designated executive positions. And after many, many years of debate at annual meeting, one of the women's positions was further designated for members who are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, members with a disability, 2S LGBTQ plus members, or racialized members. And building on the historical roots, ETFOs continue to develop resources and training. We actually have campaign training for members of designated groups, and many, many more intentional leadership programs that build up a base of leaders from historically underrepresented communities. I think that professionalism was one thing that was brought up already tonight, and it was a substantial part of. It is actually a substantial part of our members' identity, and it was a thread in the book. It was interesting to read as an ETFO member the context and development of professionalism. Now we frame it as respecting the skills and teachers' professional judgment, and that has come to mean greater autonomy as a counterweight to the pressures of standardized testing and other top-down reforms, because it's a constant struggle. Professionalism was also addressed as a moral responsibility in the book to public education, and that's still around, but it's less connected to the idea of professionalism. I think it's more an ideological commitment to public education. So some trade unionists would think that it takes away from a more militant self-defense of member economic well-being, and that we shouldn't need to bargain over public education policy, but we do. We struck for 6 days in the winter prior to the pandemic, and members were motivated by that fight for more resources for students and smaller class sizes. So that ideological commitment that comes from talking about these larger issues definitely makes for more committed membership. And those issues are obviously the working conditions of all educators. You can have a strong union that is ready to defend their own interests from the employer, but when you have union members ready to fight for their students and the principles of public education, they will absolutely do whatever is necessary to win, like walking the picket line. Historically, notions of professionalism have kept teacher unions away from the labor movement, but after a big battle with the government, I think that members can see the benefits of being part of the bigger movement. And that was the outcome of the Harris fight that was outlined in the book. ETFO joined the OFL and CLC, the Ontario Federation of Labour, and the Canadian Labour Congress. I currently sit on the OFL's executive board as one of ETFO's representatives. Along with OECTA and OSSTF, teachers and education workers make up a pretty sizable contingent of OFL and CLC conventions. In many ways, we've kind of come full circle in the defining conflict with Harris government, because we have another conservative majority government. The history and actions of the educators that were outlined in class action that came before us have made us much better prepared for that conflict. And the Ford government was less prepared, at least early on. We knew that we had strong public support in bargaining through our own internal polling, but you could also feel it on the picket lines. I saw it on the picket lines when I was out there in January and February with members, parents, community members coming with treats, hot chocolate, coffee, tea, local businesses opening up their doors for warming rooms and for the use of bathrooms. Now, of course, the pandemic has complicated a whole lot in education and what was a clear line of conflict between us and the government. ETFO had to fight for just about every single safety measure and small investment in schools with a conservative government that hardly had a plan to restart September of last year. Now, we have members that are absolutely exhausted from pandemic teaching, and we are gearing up for an election. And so much of the work of ETFO is about political activism. ETFO has now hired 4 full-time organizers to work on the campaign with members and have made election preparedness an organizational priority. We're training members now, we're mapping their workplaces, we're building capacity for electoral campaign. And knowing that Harris was reelected with a majority government after absolutely decimating public services, it gives us that extra push to do everything we can to bring down the Ford government in June, defending publicly funded education, our working conditions, and our students. And that's where we are today. Thank you, Andy, for that, for getting us to this point, for showing us the history that got us to this point.
Thank you, Shirley. Fascinating to connect the pre-1998 history with what's happening today. I couldn't have asked for better opening remarks from everyone. So I'm going to ask about 3 questions and then take some audience questions. So make sure to get your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. This first one I think will be most relevant to Andy and Vivian, but everyone can feel free to chime in. So a major theme in the book, as has been discussed, is the struggle of women teachers for fairness in the workplace, including work conditions and pay equity. Can you reflect on what was gained by women teachers having their own union up until 1998, and how this the structure of having their own union also disadvantaged women teachers, if you believe that that was the case?
Bean, you want me to go first?
Yeah, I think you should.
Okay. Okay. It's interesting because the research shows that women actually made more significant gains through feminism than they did than the 2 unions did negotiating through collective bargaining, because there was such a far leap to go to get equity. Back in the 60s, women would be making half of what a male teacher, a man would make in the same classroom with the same qualifications. So when the FWTAO finally got acceptance of the equity argument, and ironically, the men came on board at the last minute because there were some of their teachers that it would affect as well. There were huge gains to be made, but that was possible because the women could make those statements without having to go through their own union first. So OSSTF, for example, if the Status of Women Committee there wanted to move forward on something, they would first have to get the agreement of the larger body, which was over half male. So there was this filter that they always had to consider. FWTAO did not have to do that. They could make some very strong statements and stick with them, and then use whatever power they had. And they were very good at connecting with the sitting government and lobbying, particularly with the Liberals, it turned out, that they could get their program moved forward. So I think it was really important, and I think that's what we've lost in a sense from when we lost FWTAO. I don't want to say that ETFO is not paying attention to those things, but the voice of women, for women, by women, that was extremely important in a time when men's voices were considered the only really valid ones. So I think that's the key piece, is that there were maybe one other union in Canada that spoke with the SORWAC, that spoke with the voice of women, and yeah. So what that was half the question. The other half being, what was the disadvantage? And of course, the disadvantage was that when it came to collective bargaining, there was not a strong single voice, which we see now with ETFO. So that there was always this conflict going on between the men and the women, and in fact, none of the women's the women's issues, I shouldn't say none, very few of them ever got to the negotiating table. So in collective bargaining, it was a problem having two separate unions, even though they negotiated at the same time. So coming together as one union definitely strengthened their position in many ways.
Yeah, I think that I thought of, we got these questions ahead, so I had a little bit of time to think about it. But I think, as Andy said, just having a single gender union in the period when FW existed did give them an opportunity to pursue issues without male opposition and they did have quite a bit of influence on the advancement of pay equity legislation and changes to laws that discriminated on the basis of marriage status and pregnancy. So my understanding was predated me, but my understanding is the Federation of Women Teachers did contribute to those social advances, the equal pay legislation that affected them, ultimately affected other women workers as well. And I think there were some issues, and as Andy said, they took things to Queen's Park on their own. One good example is that's documented in the ETFO history, actually, is they lobbied the government to enable women teachers to apply directly for the principal's course rather than going through their school boards, because school boards had a male bias as well. I mean, it was a societal thing. It wasn't unique to school boards or anywhere else, but it was harder for women to make advancements. And so once women could apply directly to the principal's course, the percentage of women who got accepted into that course and became principals increased dramatically. And during the years that I was working with OPS MTF and then OPSTF, one of the things the government did was track the number of women who were getting into positions of senior responsibility. And I think by the time that we got to the time when that ETFO was created, the women had really almost caught up, or certainly made huge gains. So there wasn't the need on that one issue for a woman's voice so much anymore, that women had really won the right to apply to be principals and to be principals. And so that's just one example. I think also having a single gender union, again, I'm saying this as somebody from outside, but that it naturally gives leadership opportunities to women who could be, they filled all the positions within the executive, all the positions locally, all the positions on staff were women. And so for that period in their evolution, it gave a lot of leadership experience that was useful for, phase two when ETFO was established. And also, I think what my former FW colleagues, who still mourn the loss, there was, at the time of amalgamation, there were different, attitudes towards the two unions coming together. But there were some who were, really sad about the loss, understandably, about the loss of FW, because they didn't have the same freedom to support feminist causes, and they had a real history, as Andy documents, to contributing to National Action Committee on the Status of Women or LEAF. And ETFO, to its credit, has done that. But I think that it's because of the determination of the women, but it's also because that they brought that history with them to ETFO, and the women leaders who continued into ETFO brought commitment to the broader women's movement with them. So I think that was the benefit of being on their own, was that. And fortunately, it's not the same as having a gender specific union, but fortunately, I think ETFO has done a fairly good credit. Other people, can agree or disagree with that, but I think ETFO has done a pretty good job continuing its commitment to women's issues, and that's in large part because of the structural protections for women in terms of representation on the executive and also the program budget. ETFO puts a lot of money into training women leaders and supporting women leaders. And Shirley might want, she's already talked about that, I think. So.
Just thinking of that, not because teaching is my second career, but, my first career as a residential counselor working at the YWCA, all women belonging to CUPE. Trying to achieve some sort of pay equity, and we had no comparison. The pay equity parity comparisons we were using were with the hospital, because there was no we just didn't, there were no males that were doing the kind of work that we were doing at the YWCA to have a comparison to for wages. And I will say that the work of FW in trying to achieve that pay equity, teachers are one of the very few unions where both males and females in the union enjoy the same pay, and that is definitely that historical work that has made that happen for us. And I think that, and not being part of FW way back then, I know that as a young woman in the workforce, even with CUPE, that I benefited, but so did a whole bunch of other women benefit from the work that FW was doing, just for the labor movement in general, for young women in the workforce. So yeah, that, and I'm definitely a recipient of that, that focused leadership training for women in ETFO. I took those trainings for the women-only leadership opportunities, and it definitely helped me on my journey.
I'm going to move on to the next question, but just wanted to check, Bryan, if you wanted to add anything.
Just very briefly, obviously the strength of FW was in creating the kind of culture of women's advancement and the advancement of feminist perspectives among teachers, and connections with women's organizations, all of which everyone has alluded to. But I guess the point, and Andy did allude to this, one big union in principle is always better than two smaller ones. However, you have to balance that off with this very complicated history. What seems to me interesting in this is that the gendered division between the women's teachers organization and the men's was, am I right on this, Andy, virtually mandated by the state?
Yes. Yeah.
So, and that mandating by the state was part of a moment in history that was layered in male supremacy and patriarchal values and understandings. What's interesting is how that carries on, and then the women turn that to their own purposes. And they're doing that at a moment in history when, in fact, the male supremacy, the overt male supremacy, it's still with us, of course, but the overt male supremacy, the mandated patriarchal differentiations, have become, in some senses, antediluvian and can be recognized by so many people as out of step with, their contemporary realities. Then the possibilities of amalgamation come into being. They're resisted and advocated in both unions at a certain point, right? There's a balance there, and then it comes about, and then Shirley is sort of living with the consequences of that. And what's interesting is to try to make those consequences all the positives and to get rid of all the negatives, which I think is, in fact, the trajectory of what's being done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm certainly learning a lot. This is fascinating stuff, and I've also read the book, but this is adding even more. I'm going to jump to the next question, and then take some audience questions. So, as has been mentioned, another theme in the book, big theme, is neoliberalism, or the cutting of public services, privatization, all of that. Really beginning in the 70s, accelerating into the 90s, and its effect on education and how teachers push back. Can you reflect on one or more specific moments or policies where neoliberalism was imposed and how teachers fought back and what was learned? You could use examples from pre-ETFO or post.
Yeah, picking an example. There were well, I think in the 80s, when we saw that rash of strikes happening, I mentioned that it appeared like the teacher unions were competing to see who could go on strike first, because from 1975 for the next decade, there was rounds of wage controls. So the federal government would impose them, the provincial government would impose them, and then the federal government imposed them again. So we saw the wage controls holding the public sector back, and in this case, teachers. So when that lid came off, there was just this incredible rush to catch up. And so I think it's very interesting to see that as neoliberalism comes rolling in the 80s, that's when teachers really rose up, elementary teachers really rose up. And of course, one of the most interesting examples is the election of the NDP. So we have a socialist government imposing wage and price controls through what became known as Ray Days. And of course, the teachers reacted to that and pushed back in terms of still having their strikes for other issues. And that cost, I think that cost, well, I know it cost Bob Ray the support of all the teachers. So neoliberalism was not, it arrived full born. It was also something that developed over time. So we saw the strikes, but we also saw the creation of junior kindergarten, which is definitely not neoliberal in its form. So there was this kind of up and down thing, or waves as neoliberalism kind of evolved over time, and in particular ways that fit with this province?
Yeah, I think there are lots of, when we're thinking about this question, that pretty well described the whole Harris period. That was huge when, all the things that the Harris government introduced was an incredible situation for anybody in the public sector or anybody living in Ontario to respond to. But I think looking back over my career, I was personally more taken aback by the austerity agenda that Dalton McGuinty introduced in 2012. So, we lived through the Harris period. Teachers were sort of taken aback by the NDP social contract. And then we had a period of about almost a decade where things went well with the Liberal government, and ETFO worked very hard with the Liberal government to undo a lot of the initiatives that the Harris government brought forward. And I think we're quite successful in that. I won't give you the whole list. But in 2012, when McGuinty, introduced the commission that looked at how to save money from the public sector, and then talked over the union's heads to teachers, had a television presentation to teachers trying to get around the union. And I think because there had been such support from the McGuinty government for so long, I think McGuinty misjudged teachers and the unions and the ability of the unions to mobilize. And I think one of the things that ETFO learned is how important it was to keep in touch with its members and to be able to have members really rally to the side of the union cause when needed. And we sort of lost that ability from 2003, when the McGuinty government was elected, to 2012, I'd argue, because things were going pretty well and we did a lot of really good work and achieved a lot. But that about face by McGuinty, it was almost a gift to the union because it gave us a rallying call, and the negotiations that followed that. And I think Sam Hammond is with us today, and he really, it was under Sam's leadership, I think, and we did a lot of work up until then. I don't want to discredit or not acknowledge the work of all the presidents leading up to then, but that 2012 year when Bill 115 was introduced was really when ETFO demonstrated that it really was the most militant teacher union in the province. And I know that I was it was really a great time to be an ETFO staff member because I was so proud of the union, and the members came out and they rallied behind, and it wasn't that it was, we took that case to the charter case. We haven't talked about the whole reliance on unions in terms of using the courts to resolve their problems around collective bargaining. And we started that right in 1982 when the Davis government introduced the Inflation Restraint Act. So ETFO increasingly used the courts, but and we ultimately won that charter challenge, but it took years before Bill 115 was deemed to be wrong according to the charter. But going back to my point, the ability to mobilize our members was key, and we were able to do that largely because of our ability to the size of the organization. The fact that we were the largest organization gave us many more resources financially, but also it wasn't just money. The union, because of its size, was able to provide a breadth of programs much larger than any other union. So we protected and we kept up the professional development program that other unions let go by the wayside just to focus primarily on collective bargaining. We had I keep saying we, I am retired, but ETFO still has a really important equity and women's services department that extended the work of the union, not just to its diverse members, but to the community. So during that period, all the things that was leading to ETFO's evolution as a strong union came to the fore. And I think that there's no question that Dalton McGuinty retired shortly after the the height of the protest against Bill 115. It wasn't just the gas plants. He lost his moniker as the education premier, and it's because of the strong teacher reaction to that government, and it was really led by ETFO under the leadership of Sam. So anyway, I think we learned a lot, and I think ETFO is continuing to try to build on that. A lot of the things that ETFO used at its disposal, it doesn't have anymore in terms of having an impact on elections, but that's another book.
And if we take that to today, like what has been happening over the last 2 years in education? I mean, we went from walking the picket line to a pandemic. We went from walking the picket line and trying to educate the public. I mean, we had a government that's talking about privatization. We have a government that's talking about giving parent choice, which leads us down the path of privatization. We have a government that wants to mandate online learning in secondary school. So we're on the picket line. All the affiliates are together at one point in time. We're all picketing together. Then we get hit by a pandemic. And we're forced, because of the situation, and I think the Conservative government takes complete advantage of the fact that we are in a pandemic to forward their online learning agenda. And so we have now, teachers were being forced to make a failed education model as far as online learning. They're forced to make it work because there's no other choice because of the situation we're in. And then you fast forward, now we're 18 months. And what do we have? We have some boards that have embraced hybrid learning for elementary and secondary, but I'll focus on elementary. And we see that the mobilization of members becomes really important. And then as we start to mobilize members, the louder we complain, what does the Ford government do? But they completely introduce a notwithstanding clause, and they silence labor unions, so that that voice of being able to hold the government accountable for the decisions they're making, they're trying to silence that. So that becomes, now we have to get a little bit more creative. How do we then mobilize members to be more creative? And you know how you do that is, now what happens is ETFO has started to make those partnerships that they had with parents, that support that we saw on the picket line that I think has always happened. I think even Andy talks about that in his book, of always having those, the parental support is almost always there. And so now what we see is us harnessing that looking at those community groups, those organizations, those grassroots organizations and those parent groups, and working with them to start to get the message out about the damage of privatization and the neoliberalism views and ideals that are still there. And so we can see that happening today, and we have to come up with creative ideas to figure out how to get our point across without coming across as criticizing the provincial government a year before an election. And I think that we're doing a pretty good job trying to mobilize our members and working with communities to make that voice heard. And I think that's where we are today.
Okay. I'd turn the question around a bit. Rather than focus on a particular moment of neoliberalism, which I know can highlight a great deal, I'd stress the extent to which, from the mid to late 1970s right up to the current moment, neoliberalism its programs, its penchant for austerity, its anti-unionism, its targeting of particular sectors, and teachers and hospital workers in particular. Education and healthcare were the two sectors being the largest bite of government expenses that were always targeted in this period. That permeated the entire political economy and the culture and ideology of the last quarter of the 20th century and the first fifth of our current century. And that has had a devastating effect. And while teachers' unions may have retained some strength, unions in other sectors have been really very hard hit. And the union densities are dropping, the numbers of people in trade unions is declining, the assaults on trade unionism have been growing. And in conjunction with this, I would argue, the left has actually fallen off the radar screen as well. And this is important because the left presents a kind of leaven in the trade union movement and in the political culture that allows for opposition to grow. And with the left and the trade union movement in decline, with the ideas and the governing practices of neoliberalism very much in the ascent, we have all suffered as a consequence. And the point about this is that it took global catastrophes. First, I would argue the 2008, 2009 financial meltdown, but more importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic, which globally has established surely that all of the premises of austerity, neoliberalism, privatization do not work, do not serve the interests of people on a massive scale. And yet we know, as Shirley just pointed out, that the governing political elite is going to maintain and retain their commitment to that. And they're going to use this crisis, which surely has, the current COVID crisis has surely buried the notion that, government spending is bad. I mean, how could you maintain that and hold to that position at this current conjuncture? So as much as teachers will be fighting the good fight, I believe, and they have been, maintaining very good positions throughout this, it is going to take a long struggle to rebuild the left and to rebuild the trade union movement so that we can get back to, elementary positions around spending and caring and investing in people and progressive advancements. For the basic reality is that neoliberalism has been controlling the political agenda and cultures of our times. As Andy said, it was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's wage and price controls which initiated, in some senses, the neoliberal agenda in the mid to late 1970s. It was carried forward by an NDP government, a rare NDP government in Ontario by Bob Rae, that paved the way for the ugliest and most mean-spirited conservative implementations under Mike Harris in the late 1990s. All those political parties then bought into the premises of neoliberalism. And we need a new political culture, an alternative politics, which will sustain trade unionism and essentially re-articulate positions of the left in moments of crisis. Otherwise, we are in for a very rough ride.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for your responses. Very enlightening. I'm going to take some audience questions, but first, actually, Andy, could you tell us a little bit, could tell viewers about how you're going to be touring this book around Ontario? Because I'm sure there's people watching now who would be interested to hear if you're
Well, a shout out to the Peel teachers. I've been invited, and I believe this will be in person, but perhaps online. We're not quite sure yet. To give a presentation there. The elementary teachers in Toronto have also indicated they would like me to come and do a presentation. Lakehead University has asked me if I would do a presentation. And of course, in a sense, the gift of COVID, if I can dare say that, is that I can sit here in my living room and do such a presentation. So I will be trying to get out to as many locals as I can, and bookstores if they're ready for that. The problem being, so much of events and so forth cannot be held yet. But we're making an effort for me to get out to meet people, to sign books, and particularly through ETFO locals.
Great, thank you. So if anyone wants, you can get in touch with Andy. I'm happy to field emails, and you can invite him to give a talk, sign some books. I'll just put my email in the chat. I'm gonna take a question from the audience. I hope this doesn't put anyone too much in the hot seat, but because there was an amalgamation once, I'm gonna ask about amalgamation again. So John Humphrey asks, are there any prospects of amalgamation with Catholic teachers, or will that have to await amalgamation of the separate boards? Does the history Andy describes give any clues as to the way forward in that regard? And I totally apologize if I just stepped on a minefield. I don't know the political landscape of the teachers' unions well enough.
Go ahead, Vivian.
I actually thought it's a political question for the union, but
Yeah.
I mean, ETFO does have a policy in support of a single school system. So the issue isn't really whether or not ETFO would amalgamate with Electa. There has been historical discussions, and there's some interest within, between ETFO and OSSTF, because OSSTF is the other English language public teachers union. So that's a more natural one to amalgamate with. But the ETFO policy is a single school system that represents the French language rights. So in the ideal world, from the ETFO position, there would be, I guess, two unions, a Francophone union and ETFO, or whatever the new name of the organization was. But it's it's a long, it is a very complicated issue, and the rationale, a lot of people talk about, a single school system saving a lot of money. I've never personally been that convinced by that, because you don't change the number of students, you don't change the number of teachers by very much, or senior staff, a few buildings maybe, especially in northern Ontario and small rural communities where you might have 4 underpopulated schools because you have 4 school systems. But in the larger urban centers, you're not going to really save any money by having a single school system. So I don't know, other people may want to answer the question.
It has always been, I think, a topic of conversation. And I remember being at annual meeting when we voted on that actually to become a policy statement for ETFO, was single school system. It has come up in years past. It has come up to explore and research, the possibility of amalgamating with different unions, but it's not something that's on the horizon. I think that working with the other unions, with the other affiliates, has been something that's been happening, and it's been something that was produced when we were negotiating our contracts all at the same time, pre-pandemic, and seeing all the affiliates working together when we had a massive, day walking on the picket line with all the affiliates together, which was an amazing experience, being a union leader and doing that. But at this point, I think that we're all so busy just trying to advocate for the current issues in education and trying to, fight privatization. And, that's not been number one on the list of conversations. Members' health and safety and well-being and the working conditions have definitely been first and foremost topics of conversation.
We're just at an hour and 16 minutes, so we're going to wrap up in a second, but I have one last question for Andy. This is from Shirley Zebedee. Andy, who do you hope this book will, who do you think this book will influence, or who will be affected by it the most? And what do you hope its effect will be to this group of people and to other readers in general?
Well, that's interesting because when I was writing it, I had to have a reader in mind. And it turned out I was writing it for a grade 4 teacher in mid-career, a woman. And I don't know why, but that just stuck. But once the book started to, it was finished and take shape, I realized that it's, first of all, for activists. I think it's an essential read for any of the political activists in ETFO, because you need to know your history. And as Shirley mentioned, there's things that are in the book that I now read in the paper because the same things are happening with Doug Ford kind of thing. So I think, first of all, I want to be reaching activists. And then there's a group of, my experience has been that in mid-career, teachers tend to start to get a little time on their hands. They're no longer having to work quite so hard. So that group of teachers, I think, in my mind anyway, I'm hoping to reach out to them. So the activists, but further to that, as Bryan alluded to, there's a real, and I didn't realize how strong this was when I was writing it, because I'm just pulling material together, but there's a really strong feminist stream that runs through this. So I think the history of what women have done in this very narrow window, being the school system, I think that's really important, that feminists or women who feel that they have a feminist sentiment, and quite honestly, men as well. I think men who feel they're allies to their feminist partners or whatever, I think that this would reach out to them. So that's, in my mind anyway, who it is, who would be most interested in this. But we all went to school and we all went through some of these things, and I know a number of my students who wouldn't even have remembered the Harris years because they were too young, and so this kind of opens up that world for them, I hope, anyway.
I can see some of your students or parents of your students have been watching and have commented in the chat, and they're very proud of what you've been able to do here. We're going to close up in a second. I want to invite Shirley, Bryan, Vivian, if you have any final remarks to make. If you want to make fun of Andy for anything, now's your last chance.
Andy, you know what? I have so much enjoyed reading this, and I do think that it is an essential read for our young teachers that are entering the profession, because what was good for me, that that history of the 6%, and I know that the 6% is there, and I know how important it is. But to be able to put some real context behind the importance of that, of maintaining and protecting that programming for women, I think is really important. And I think that piece of history with everything else, like all of the things that led up to where we are today. But I think that's important for our new members to read and understand, because it's still a topic of discussion. You know, and I think that that's an important piece that we need to understand where it came from and how important it is to maintain as part of our culture moving forward. So thank you. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to do this. So thank you.
Well, I'd just like to again congratulate Andy on a fantastic job and a great book, and just maybe suggest to Shirley that, you know, I'm sure Between the Lines would give you a very good deal on a bulk order that you could contribute to your membership.
Thank you, Bryan.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Bryan, because staff are always doing training sessions, and we were always looking for books to give away as a prize. So I would suspect that you know, that Shirley can pass that on to the appropriate staff as a suggestion.
Christmas is coming, and I'm sure that members would like their stockings to be stuffed with Andy's book.
Congratulations. I don't have anything to add. I think, you know, the whole history piece is really important. Andy will remember at a certain point when we got the idea that, you know, younger members didn't really want to hear about the history, right? They were tired about hearing about the old war stories. But I think, you know, I think this book actually is a good example of why people that are in the education business in terms of training militants and activists need to continue with the history and just, you know, make it interesting and relevant. And the book does that. So the book, I think, is a really good training tool for people. Yeah. So anyway,
thank you, Vivian.
Good for you, Andy. And I hope you get on a canoe trip soon. So.
I just want to mention something that, connected to that Bryan mentioned how the dissertation was very different from the book. And one of the key pieces I really wanted was to make it as readable as possible. A dry history isn't benefiting anyone. So I tried to make this something that teachers would want to pick up after reading the first couple of pages. They'd want to keep reading. And I hope I've done that.
I think
you didn't sacrifice any of the research in doing that, so it's great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for spending a bit of your evening with us. This was very interesting. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, so you can view it there and subscribe to our YouTube. And the book, the link to buy the book is in the chat. Also, go ask your local bookstore and library. Make sure they're carrying it as well. Stay safe, everyone, and have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you, David.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.